Welcome tonight to this event by the Menard Family George Washington Forum at Ohio University. Thanks for tuning in. You'll have a chance after and then during the event tonight to ask questions of tonight's guest. If you look below in the Zoom webinar, there's a Q&A function. Feel free to ask your question and we'll pose it to Zena Hitz. Our guest tonight is Zena Hitz. She's a tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. She was an undergraduate at St. John's before going off to Cambridge, Chicago, and finally Princeton for graduate degrees in philosophy. She teaches there now, but before returning to St. John's in 2015, she taught at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Auburn and McGill. Plus, she spent a few years in the remote Ontario woods away from universities, learning to love learning again. And her most recent book, part of which deals with that, is Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life. We'll be talking about that tonight. Thanks for joining us, Zena. Appreciate you being here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So
I take this book to be about what it is to be a full human being and the intellectual life as a sort of path to be a full human being. It deals with universities and the kind of problems that many see facing them today, but it's about a lot more. But I want to begin with just a simple question, right? You seem to think the intellectual life's a good thing. And I just wondered, how do you read? Where do you read? How do you write? Right? You've written a book. What's the space look like? What do you do? Can you concentrate?
It's a funny question because, in some ways my book is written to help ordinary people do this kind of thing, to read and to write. So I often get asked for, what's the discipline? What's the routine? What's the secret? And I don't have one. So I read on my couch, I read in a comfy chair, I read at a desk. I write where I can, usually on a laptop or a regular computer. I write when I have to. I write when there's a deadline. I write when someone says, if you don't do this, you're going to be ashamed, and the shame keeps me going. So I think for me, the thing that I have received, for which I'm very grateful, which I would tell any young person to cultivate, is I read a lot when I was younger, and I learned to really enjoy it. And I learned some habits of patience. That is, I know for a fact from my own experience that when you sit with a difficult book, even if it's driving you crazy, the words are swimming on the page, you can't make any sense of it. If you sit with it and find someone to talk to about it, you will learn something. So I think that's what experience and habits can teach you and what you can cultivate when you're young. And that way, no matter how chaotic and undisciplined your life is and how undisciplined you are by nature, you know that that thing that you're reaching for is really worth it. And that's the space that you want to get to. You want to have that deep motivation to do it because you know from your own experience that it's worthwhile. You know those satisfactions of learning. And that's, I think, really that is the secret, and everything else is secondary. It's learning to love and to enjoy this stuff, which just takes practice and time and help. You need help from others.
Okay, so you write on a laptop. You're not writing on paper with a fountain pen.
I do sometimes, okay. Because I if I find myself getting distracted too much online, I might just start handwriting, shut down the computer and start handwriting. But no, normally I write on a computer. I do read books. I read paper books.
Yeah.
I don't read online just because otherwise all that time at the screen hurts my eyes. But I like to turn pages and
mark things up.
Yeah. Mark things
up. Okay, good. So you're a normal person. You sort of get distracted sometimes. You write on computers, you write wherever you can. You're like everybody trying to shove it in.
No one's ever called me normal, but I have a normal lack of discip. I'd put it that way.
Okay, good. So we got out of the way. You're not superhuman when it comes to intellectual life. The other thing I just want to see if I can just maybe, get out of the way. There's what I think of like an old-fashioned defense of liberal arts education, which is it's content, right? That there's a certain things that you need to know if you live in a liberal democracy in the Western world. Something like, E.D. Hirsch's cultural literacy, is kind of one version of that. Is your book just a rehash version of that?
So it isn't. It isn't like that really at all. It does defend relatively traditional form of liberal arts education of the kind that we do at St. John's, which is, pretty old fashioned.
What is that like? What do you do at St. John's?
Well, so we have an all required curriculum based on great books. We have a 4-year seminar series starting with the ancient Greeks and going up into the 20th century of literature and philosophy and political theory. We have a mathematics program where we read classics of mathematics, starting with Euclid, going up through Newton and Einstein. We have music and science and languages also worked in there. So it's the kind of thing which, if you were coming at it from a cultural literacy point of view, you might look at it and say, oh yes, that's just what we're looking for. It's all the classics, it's the Western heritage. But I don't think of it that way. And I don't actually think many of my colleagues think of it that way either. It's a very profound encounter with very rich books, which ask fundamental questions, which I think are in the heart of every human being. They're in what's interesting, what we call the Western tradition, which is really a much more complicated thing than that. It's a lot of different traditions tied together one way or another. It's a bunch of books that talk about each other. And you have those in other civilizations, other forms of culture. You have traditions where there's books talking to one another. And that's what we have. It allows for a certain depth to your education, a certain breadth to read over some centuries, a variety of reflections, where you can see one of the reasons I object to cultural literacy is a human being, the author of a great book, and any of us, is a creative, active being. We don't just read and take in like we're downloading a PDF, into our hardware. We respond, we react, we digest what we read, and we remake it in some way in our own time and place and according to our own character. That's what you see when you study the traditions, and that's what you see that's what you really need to do when you read these books is become alive, develop your mind in your desires in such a way that you are thinking and understanding the things that really matter to human beings. So it's a much more process focused than content, but I do think the content is important. That is fundamental questions that matter to every human being. That's important as content, but cultural literacy, I think, is much too narrow and really doesn't provide the kind of education that I would want to provide for my students.
Yeah. So it was there in that answer that you just gave, or the bit that you just talked about there. You said, it's human questions, and one of the things that's notable about your book is you think that human beings are human beings are human beings, right? That there are deep commonalities across cultures, races, sexes of what a human being is, and the entire first part of your book is about you say that we all have, or we should have, what you call a single basic orientation in our lives, and you use words like ultimate value, natural need, desires, all the stuff taken out of Aristotle. I just wonder if you could, this will be foreign to lots of people listening to this. What is a single basic orientation? What is a natural need? What is a right and a wrong desire?
Well, let's start with the big one, namely, what's an ultimate end? What if, and it's, by the way, not something which I think we ought to have, but something which I think we do have, as a matter of fact. There just is something that everyone on this call, and me, we all care about more than anything. You don't know what it is necessarily, because if you were to ask yourself, what do I care about most? you'd say, oh, well, my family and learning and, being comfortable and my church and, my football team and what have you. You might say all kinds of things. But when the chips were down, if you were in a crisis, there's one of those things that you would pick over another if they came into conflict. So that's the idea of an ultimate end. There's something in which you think your happiness really lies, the meaning of your life really lies. And that's the thing which, when the chips were down, you would choose over something else. So, but it doesn't have to be something good. You might hope it was your family, or you might hope it was mathematical truth, or all kinds of, or justice, or all kinds of things, the love of God. But it might turn out to be protecting your reputation, or making a little more money, or things like that. And it's not that necessarily it's bad to want money or it's bad to protect your reputation, but you don't want that to be driving the bus of your life. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you sacrifice your family to protect your reputation. You sacrifice truth to make an extra buck. That's not what you want to do. So that's the kind of framework that I'm working with, is that our desires have a kind of order, they have a hierarchy, and you want to think about what it is, because you don't want to find out at the wrong moment that your priorities were in the wrong order.
How would you know how would you know? I just linger that on that a sec. How would you judge what a hierarchy of needs or goods or ends are? Right. I mean, you mentioned hierarchy. How would you distinguish between them, or what are ways to thinking about what's near the top and the bottom of that totem pole?
So the classic distinction, which is crucial, it's not everything, but it's important, is things that are good for the sake of something else, instrumental goods, means to ends, and things which really matter in their own right. So, money is a good thing. Why is it good? Well, it's good because it provides for comfort, it provides stability, it can get you an education and your children an education. It can get you a nice place to live. It can get you all kinds of things which are good, food to eat, food on the table. But if money becomes just an end in itself, where all you're doing is watching the numbers go up, and it's sucking energy away from things that matter more to you, then that's not good. So that's an instrumental good. Money, social status too. You can use social status for good, but if all you're doing is climbing the ladder, it's not good. So then there are things which matter for their own sake. Okay, they matter. These are activities which time drops away. All you care about is what you're doing in that moment. Might be sitting with your family, just having a good time. It might be something darker than that. You're at the hospital bed with someone that you really care about, and that's all you've got right there. But it matters for its own sake that you're there. You're not there for any other reason than for love. Going to church, and thinking, creating, imagining, the arts and the sciences, and reading and studying, these things also matter for their own sake. So that's the basic distinction I want to make. Things which are leisured and have their goodness all packed into them, and things which are good because you want something else out of them.
Yeah, one of the things, maybe another way of rephrasing that, when you read your book, the things you find good are things that drag you outside of yourself, and the things that you find less good are things that focus you purely on yourself. Is that a fair enough way of? It
is, only it gets complicated because there's a way in which thought and reflection are inward. So there's ways of looking at yourself that are wholesome and good and deepen your experience and give you a core in life. And there are ways of looking at yourself that are not good, that are self-involved, that are at the surface, are selfish in a bad way.
Yeah, right. So clarify that. The intellectual life is something that drags you inward in the Hitz reading in order to let you have a deeper communion with others and with the world around you, right? So that's the one that would be the exception to the Hitz rule, as I take it. All right, so
fair enough.
So you love learning, not because you want to do a kind of cultural literacy thing. This is not just a warmed over version of that. And you have you sort of come at it first from thinking, what is a human being? And you have in your word a kind of hierarchy of ends, and the ones that kind of drag you outside of yourself, looking outside of yourself, are better than ones that are purely self-focused, with the possible exception of the intellectual life. So can we talk about that intellectual life, the way that you describe it? You talk a lot about inwardness and withdrawal. What is inwardness and withdrawal? Like, how does education, or how does the intellectual life, not education, right? I think you distinguish between those, but how does the intellectual life help us be inward? And what is it to be inward? Why do you want to withdraw from the world? That's not a good thing, is it?
Well, I mean something very specific by withdrawal from the world, or by going inward. And it's almost just a negative idea. So if you think about, your vision of yourself when you walk into the high school cafeteria, and there's the table of cool kids, and there's the table of the jocks, and there's the table of the nerds, and there's the table of the cheerleaders, and there's the table of the and there's a little ranking, which table is which. That's the world, one way or another. And we may have graduated from high school, but many of us still live in our imaginations in that world. We're seeing ourselves as we are ranked by our social environment. And we may be trying to climb it. We may be just trying to survive and avoid humiliation, but somehow that's telling us who we are. And even if we're the winners, I like the stories of the losers, the people at the bottom of the barrel who retreat from that world of judgment and find their own dignity in reading and thinking and studying and writing poetry, what have you. But it's true, even if you're the winner, that's not really where your value as a human being comes from. It doesn't come from being on the top of a social ranking. It comes from who you are, independent of all that. So the point of withdrawal and the point of retreat and inwardness is to get away from that social ranking system and into things which you really care about and which give you a certain amount of dignity or worth in and of yourself. Give you a kind of space of retreat where you can reflect, where you can think about things, where you can ask yourself how you want to act in the world that's around you. I think that's familiar to most people. I don't think it's a crazy out there idea, but I do think it's fundamental to intellectual life.
So it's looking inside to see who you really are, right? Yeah. It's a kind of like taking the temperature of yourself, and that takes a little bit of separation from the world around to look.
Maybe honestly. a lot of separation. Yeah. Depends on how, on what your social environment's like. If you're in a very oppressive totalitarian environment, you better go inward, or you're going to think you are whoever your environment is telling you. If you're a prisoner, if you're being belittled and put down every second, you better find a place inside of you so that you can find out who you really are and what really matters about you.
Yeah, you write a lot about prisoners in this book and reading. It was one of the interesting things. Dorothy Day in prison, Malcolm X in prison. And you hold up, they're not the only ones, but you have you have three people who, it seems to me, when reading your descriptions of them, you really seem to kind of warm to them as people who sought the intellectual life. It's a unusual trinity. The Virgin Mary, Einstein, and Malcolm X. And so
what do you mean what's unusual about that? Doesn't everyone put those three together?
This is not the Reese's peanut butter cup, two great tastes that go right together. These are, it's slightly discordant. So what is it about the Virgin Mary, Einstein, and Malcolm X that made them, for you, kind of models of, what an intellectual life can be?
Well, all three of them, when you think about it, or if you know enough about them, were failures. And in their failure, found a key moment of their lives, a transformative moment. So Malcolm X's most obvious type of failure, he went to prison for theft as a young man. He was a Black man in the 1940s. He was not highly respected. His father was murdered by the Klan. His family was broken up by the welfare office. This is a person who was carrying a lot of humiliation, a lot of suffering. And he ends up in prison, and he reads the entire prison library while he's in prison. And he becomes just a different person, a person who's principled, directed, focused, alive, passionate, and inward, always, an activist in obvious ways, but very much constantly reflecting on basic principles and the meaning of his life. So that's Malcolm X. Now, Albert Einstein is not widely known, but it should be known. He could not get a job after he finished graduate school. He could not get an academic job. I like to tell that especially to graduate students because this is a consolation, I think. And so he got a job. He had a family to support. He got a job working in a patent office. And he would do his patent office work first. And then with the time he had done, he would do some work on physics. And it was in the patent office where he did a lot of his most groundbreaking work. The 1905 papers, which are these 3 incredible papers Einstein writes, they're all written in the patent office. So he calls the patent office at one point his cloister, the cloister where he hatched all these beautiful ideas. So that's another person who's a failure, but who finds in their failures strength and dignity and transformation. Now, the Virgin Mary, it's not brought out in the scriptures. You have to think about it. You have to imagine your way into her world. But when you think about it, she's a young woman, probably a teenager. She's pregnant, and no one knows she's betrothed to someone else, and no one knows who the father is. Now, in that world that she lives in, that qualifies for the death penalty. That is humiliation, death, exile. It's generous of Joseph, as they say, to just divorce her quietly. He doesn't have to do that. But she knows through her faith and a tradition I'm interested in, that she's a reader. She's read the prophets. She's read the scriptures. She knows that what she's doing is the right thing. So it gives her the strength to stand against this public humiliation and risk of danger of death. So that's what all 3 of them have in common, as unlikely as it might seem. They are all people who were required to go inward, and because of that, found dignity in themselves and a wealth of things for others also. They're also people of great power to serve their communities.
One of the interesting things to me is you seem interested in people who don't have just kind of what I'll call one conversion experience, but 2 or 3. And Malcolm X is one of them. Augustine's another, and we'll talk about him in a sec. But you talk about Malcolm X reading changed him while in prison, and then at the end of his life, there's a second kind of inwardness in which he realized that the first conversion had been problematic, and that he needed, in a sense, a second, we might call it a moderating of views, but certainly a change of his views as well. So part of the call you seem to be having is for that it's not just, you don't solve the problem, that it's the intellectual life is a lifelong pursuit.
Well, I think that's also a part of the dimension of inwardness I'm interested in. It's not just a place you go once. You need to have a core that you're able to get in touch with, to connect with, because you're always in danger of getting pulled into some activity, some habit, some social world, which is in conflict with the things that you care about most.
So one of the things you talk about, so, there are models, X, Einstein, and Virgin Mary. These are models of people changed by intellectual life. But then you think, well, what is the intellectual life? And you begin with it saying it's hard, right? It's all about asceticism. It's about, we learn through failure. Pain is the greatest teacher. There are students listening to this. I'm not sure that is this the best way to sell learning? No, it is, and is antithetical to everything that we are told. Make it fun, make it this, make it, engage them, make it the word I hate, relatable. But you're saying no, suffer, deny yourself. I mean, so what does asceticism look like in intellectual life for Zena Hitz, and how do your students take it when you say time for suffering, 3 of the semester?
I don't think it's true that you students who are listening actually don't believe in suffering. You may not think about it in your coursework, but most students like sports, and most people really respect athletes who are really good at what they do. And we all know that athletes suffer and sacrifice in order to develop certain talents. So in a way, why should intellectual life be different than that? Why would you expect that, learning how to run or learning how to throw would take a lot of practice, would take a lot of discipline, would take some sacrifice? I mean, you couldn't eat what you wanted. I mean, you couldn't do everything you wanted every minute. Why would we think that, but think that somehow learning, using your mind, developing your mind, why would we think that wouldn't be painful at all, but would just be like eating cupcakes? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense, right? So we know basically that everything worthwhile takes some suffering. Think about, again, or relationships. It's another classic example that I think many people can recognize. Okay, you could take the path of least resistance and just have multiple relationships, one after the other. You'll feel empty inside. If you want to commit to somebody, if you want to stay with somebody, you're going to suffer. It's going to cost you something. You're not going to be able to do everything that you want. You're going to see things go by that you missed. So it's, in a way, just an application of that general truth that everything worthwhile is an effort, and it takes some sacrifice, and it causes some pain. And to encourage students to, don't run away from that pain when you open up your reading and you think, holy mackerel, I can't read this by tomorrow. I can't understand what's going on here. Where are the cliff notes? Don't do that. Just sit with it, push past that initial resistance, and you won't be sorry. You don't want to be a student the way that I'm an athlete. I've never learned how to run in my life. Like, I start running and it hurts and I stop. You don't want to be like that. So take courage and take on a little bit of suffering, and it'll pay off in the end.
I hope one of your career goals is not to have a named chair in a school of education in the United States. They'll see this on YouTube and deny you immediately. All right, so you're advocating a kind of good for you asceticism of life. I buy it. So one of the things you have and say, like, one of the barriers to this is a common one, and you talked about it at the very beginning. You talked about when you're writing, sometimes you're on a computer and you get sucked into your Twitter account or looking at Facebook or Instagram or what Bill Belichick calls snap face. So Bill Belichick, it's the kind of thing he'd say. So it sounds like a stupid question, but what's wrong with being dominated by your senses? It's natural, right? I mean, what's wrong about that? I mean, it's, that you may intuitively know that it's probably not good to sit and scroll through Twitter or Instagram all day long. But why is it not, right? And how, maybe it's a technique for students. How can, what are ways your students face the same things that we all do? How do they do it? How do you help them?
Yeah.
pay attention?
Yeah, it's hard. So the first thing, what's wrong with it? I mean, there's a simple thing to say, which is, your attention is limited. You're not going to have, it may feel that way, especially when you're younger, that you can you can take up your attention with all kinds of stuff that doesn't really matter and you're not losing anything. But in fact, your time on earth is limited, and the amount of attention you have to offer anything in a given day is limited. So you have to make some choices. And you don't want to spend all of your attention on things that you actually don't really care about. And I'm not afraid to just appeal to people's experience, because I think I think everyone I know, when they spend the whole day on Twitter, the whole day playing video games, don't feel very good afterwards. You don't feel like you do if you've maybe done a little bit just to distract yourself, but you've also put in some work that really mattered to you. So I'm happy just to appeal to people's experience, that there are things which are fulfilling, deeply fulfilling. There are things which you never forget having done and you never regret having done. And then there are things which are, maybe not a bad way to unwind, but you don't want to be spending your life doing that. So it's that simple. As far as techniques, I don't have any secrets. You have to know, apart from the thing I said at the beginning, you have to convince yourself, the same way that you might be convinced about the value of music from having practiced, or the value of sports for having practiced. You have to convince yourself that thinking is going to be worth what you put into it. And that's what you should be spending your time in college doing, is convincing yourself of that, just like you have with whatever else that you're interested in, music or sports or your relationships or whatever that is. Just convince yourself that it's worth some suffering. And when you've done that, then you'll have some leverage against all the things that are distracting you.
Okay. So the intellectual life is, a joke, it's about asceticism, but a positive way to do it is it's about mastering yourself. It's not being subject to someone else's whims. It's being able to control yourself. Self-control they used to have on the old-fashioned report cards. I didn't get good marks for those. Okay, so you've learned, you're a student, you're working in an insurance office. One of your things about the intellectual life is it's open to anyone, and it should be pursued by everyone in some form or another. So you've made that step of mastery. You've convinced yourself that it's worth in either a concerted stretch of the day, or even just a sort of short burst of the day, to master yourself and to throw yourself at the problem of the intellectual life. One of the things you say is it's not about content, it's about a direction, right? So that's back to that thing. It's not the original, it's not the old liberal arts education, the kind of cultural literacy deal. It's about a direction. And one of the things you say, now I just want you to talk about that actually the intellectual life helps you see the world, helps you face the world as it is. That's an unusual thing, right? One of the things that the most common things that any academic gets, and certainly since, well, you've got book learning, but you don't know about the real world. And your argument seems to be that actually the intellectual life properly pursued actually helps you stare at the ugly realities of the world. Honestly, I just wonder why you think that's the case. I mean, what are examples of that you can think of, or that you would use?
That's a great question. One example is, any intellectual endeavor that's worthwhile is going to involve an encounter with some reality, some limitation. So you're trying to do some math problem, and you just can't do it. And then finally, maybe it clicks at the last possible minute, or maybe it clicks after the exam, which is the worst part, right? Or you're reading a novel and you just love this character, and just something terrible happens to them, or they do something terrible, and it's just this the crunch of reality. So part of it is getting into the habit and even starting to enjoy that discovering of one's limitations, the discovering of that feeling of what it's like to see something for what it is. I also think, though, there's a much more concrete way that already connects to things we've been talking about, which is, it's what's the real world that people are plugging into now? A lot of it is a news cycle or a social media world or the NFL season or all kinds of things. Are these the real world? I think they're not. They're stories that are interesting, entertaining, maybe even useful, sometimes true. You can learn something from them, but they're not what's really going on. What's really going on is what's right in front of you. So one of the things going to happen when you read, say, old books, which is what I normally do, that's my favorite form of intellectual life, is you tell yourself a bunch of other stories. You learn about a lot of other places and times that are very different from the one that you live in. And that can help you to see the difference between the truth and a lie in what's around you. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think if you detach from the social competition, from the high school cafeteria world, if you accustom yourself to a different level of being, a different way of relating to the world, then I think you are just more likely to see what's really in front of you. You're more likely to see, instead of seeing the hierarchy of the cafeteria, you see the lonely kid in the back that no one's talking to. And you think, oh, well, maybe I'll talk to that kid. So I don't want to idealize it. I don't want to say that somehow intellectual life makes you into a saint. It might and it might not, but it gives you the resources to encounter reality if you really give yourself to it, if you take advantage of those opportunities.
And part of the realities are failures and human limitations, right? I mean, that's most of the stories that you have, most of the examples you have in the book are not, they're not the crests of achievement. They're the valleys in between. They're people who are suffering in one way or another.
But that is also, I mean, to the extent that there is content in great books that is learnable, it tends to be things like that. One of the authors I love is a Greek historian named Thucydides. He writes about imperial war in ancient Greece. And Athens is this incredibly powerful country. And they think to themselves, we can invade Syracuse. It'll be great. Everything's gonna be fine. They see the ships lining up and glittering in the sun. Their hearts soar. It's a colossal disaster. The whole thing ends with the destruction of the army and the destruction of the empire. And that's what we learn about. That's what human wisdom and the search for wisdom end up teaching us. It's not that it's all doom and gloom. It's not. There's also stories of redemption, of human achievement, of enduring and perseverance and glory. All of those things are in there too. But the best of those things you get when you face your limitations.
So this is the part where you've struck a chord with some of the viewers tonight. So some questions are rolling in. I'll take a break from mine and sort of pose some of them to you. So one question is, you've talked about the need for a kind of withdrawal from the world in order to lead an intellectual life. And the questioner asks, aren't friends useful for, among other things, learning? Is there a tension between friendship and that withdrawal?
Well, see, the answer is no. I'm happy to say. So, thank you for asking that, because I think it's something I had in my mind to say when we've been asking about what helps you to learn, what helps you to break free of your online compulsions. And the simplest answer to that is a bit of community, some friends, some fellow travelers, some comrades, people who you can get together with and share certain activities with, just like anything else. So the trick is, right, that you need real friends who are committed to something that you care about. And especially when you're young, it's hard to form friendships which are for real in that way, and that aren't just a way of jockeying position in the cafeteria again. So but I don't want to be too cavalier about that, because I'm speaking for myself personally. It took a lot of work to figure out who was a real friend and who was someone who I felt like I needed to survive in the social world. But anyway, companions, people to help you, people to encourage you, that's crucial. That's the piece of advice I give everyone who asks me, how can I do this? It's find a friend.
Withdrawal, but don't do it alone. So someone else want to go back to the, pain may have been my word, so I may have put stuff in your mouth. But the student asked, how do you differentiate between a kind of constructive and destructive pain of learning? Is there a point where it might be time to sort of pump the brakes on the intellectual life, or maybe intellectual life of a particular type, she asks?
Well, so it requires reflection, what I would call discernment. Where's the pain coming from, and is it worth it? So often I think college students suffer unnecessarily because they're forcing themselves to do something that someone else really wants them to do. And maybe they've got to do it, but maybe they don't. And so,
for example,
your parents are like, my only dream for you is to be a doctor. You've got to go to med school. So there you are, you're sitting in organic chemistry, the hardest class that's ever existed. And you're like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
And maybe you in your heart really do want to be a doctor too, in which case you should do it, just suffer. But maybe it's really not the right thing for you, and you need to have a talk with your parents about what you really care about. So I think there are cases like that where the pain is inappropriate. There are definitely cases where, you want to, again, same with any kind of athletic endeavor. You don't want to push yourself so hard that you lose your discipline. So, you want to find the sweet spot where it's enough of a challenge that you're being pushed. It's not easy, but it's also not so hard that you're like having anxiety attacks and panicking, and it's just so miserable that you can barely make yourself do it. So you want to try to find the middle ground, and that can take practice. There's no rules for it.
Well, it also teaches, we've all had those courses where we just, calculus for me, whatever, everybody has his or her own, where you bump up against the limitations of your own abilities and have to confront the fact that you're not that smart. There are limits. There are limits. That's
also true. So one of the real gifts that I would recommend anyone try to acquire is the gift of enjoying learning from a class where you're bad at it. God, is that hard? Oh, geez, that's the hardest thing in the world. But it is so good. It's so good to be able to do that. If you're really learning, but it's always a little humiliating, because that means that you're actually in touch with the learning itself and not just, getting in with teacher. It's really crucial that way. But these are challenges. These are projects. They don't come out of a bottle. So.
My classes are open for enrollment starting in late March.
I don't know if he endorses any of this. Just don't come to my, if you don't want to suffer, don't come to my school.
So another one of the listeners asked a good question. Is like, all right, let's get into the content, right, of what some of this stuff looks like. So we talked about, what habits of mind you need to have. What is the purpose? Let's talk about some of the content. And the person says, there are so many old books. Where do you start, right? This is a way I thought of, what three books do you recommend? People listening to this, students, non-students, whoever, what should they read? Start reading.
Well, I despite the fact that I teach at a program that's quite regimented, there's an order, it takes 4 years, there's a beginning and there's a middle and there's an ending. the truth is, depending on what you're doing and what your plans are for your life, there may not be any single right answer as to where you start. And it might be something as simple as you've got a couple of friends and you can all agree on reading Dostoevsky or reading Immanuel Kant or whatever it is. For me, if other things being equal, I say start with something ancient Greek. So you've got these wonderful epic poems, Homer, the Iliad, and Homer's Odyssey. This is the television of 800 BC. It's beautiful stories, it's gripping, it's beautiful. It takes a little bit of effort to get in, so find a friend to read it with, but very enjoyable. Plato, dialogues of Plato. It's philosophy, but it's written as a drama. You have this incredible character, Socrates, who was a historical figure. You can get a sense of who he was and who his friends were from these books. So those are some examples of things that I might start with, other things being equal. But I think it's hard enough to do, and it's rare enough, frankly, nowadays, that if something appears to you like that's particularly interesting, Augustine's Confessions or Dante or whatever happens to come across you, something Roman, if you're interested in ancient war and empire and stuff like that, go ahead and read that. Find a friend and read it, and see where it takes you.
You can see where this is going, right? The questions are rolling in now. Now people are the question somebody asked. Okay, what's your advice on the first steps to live an intellectual life? Right, just generically. It doesn't matter if you're a student or not, but that's the attendee's question. What do you do? Just start reading? What do you suggest?
So there are as many ways of living an intellectual life as there are ways of being a human being. Okay, and I'm not saying that to avoid the question. I'm saying that because it's not rigid. So for me, it's reading. So you can pick up books and read them. But some people are really interested in mathematics. They do it for fun. That's intellectual life. So find a way to do some mathematics for its own sake, not for a class, not for a degree, but just something that you think would be interesting and fun to play around with some friends. Bird watching, that's an intellectual activity, very time-honored activity. Get to know different types of birds, find out about their lives, their habits, where they fly, when. So each person, or, you might be quite religious, and there's forms of intellectual life which are appropriate for religious people, studying scripture, studying the history of the church, all of these things. There's something most likely that each of you cares about that's the tip of an iceberg of some piece of learning, and just do that learning regardless of whether you know what's going to come of it. So many young people and older people too are so regimented. Everything's got to count for something. And part of what I'm encouraging you to do is to try to get that mentality to one side and think about what kind of life you want to lead and how you want to be spending your time and what's going to really make you feel like a full human being.
There's one thing you clearly think doesn't, right? So you have this sort of related question coming out. You say, you cannot lead an intellectual life if you are super into politics, right? If you think politics really is deeply important, that is at odds with the intellectual life. That will many serious students and many serious people care lots about politics, and they read books, right? And so here we have Hitz rolling in from Annapolis saying, no. Politics, it undermines the intellectual life. How does it?
Well, I think the way you put it is a little stronger than the way I would have ever put it.
Maybe intentionally.
Politics, insofar as it's a struggle for power, is not an intellectual activity. Okay, it's a pragmatic activity. the same way that, if you're running a business and you're trying to get market share, you may be using your mind. I'm not saying it's mindless, but you're not thinking, you're not reflecting and contemplating on things for their own sake. You're trying to do something. You're trying to get something. So that's the thing that isn't, on the one hand, that is not intellectual life. And I think it can be confused with that. And I think that's bad. I think it's one of the things that you want to step back from is the struggle for power, even when that power is something that you mean to use for something that's good and worthy. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think intellectual life has to be open-ended. That is, you don't, if you're really asking yourself a question, you don't know the answers. So a lot of times what happens when political life infects intellectual life in a way that I don't like, it's because someone's already decided what they think, and they're just looking for materials to bolster their arguments. That's kind of the debate mentality too, which for fun is fine, but don't take it too seriously. You know the end position, so you're just looking for things that support the end, and you're not really learning. You're not opening yourself up to some piece of reality and asking yourself what's going to come of it. So I'm not in any way denying that you can be interested in politics and think about things on the side. Just that they're different things, and they matter for different reasons. So
one of the questioners said, ask about arrogance in intellectual life. Is the intellectual life, is it precious, right? Is it something you, Zena Hitz, can have, but plebs can't? Is this something that, that relates to another question I want to ask you about, something you said about Plato's Republic later on, but is this counsels of arrogance on your part?
So this is a question that has haunted me for many years. So I want to be careful about it. It matters to me. I think it can start out that way. I think for most people like myself who are in an intellectual line of work, we're kind of official, professional intellectuals, we're college professors or what have you. We often start out because we just need to feel superior to other people. That's just you've got to do it. You fail at something else, like me, you're bad at sports, so you've got to be good at something, and maybe it's school, maybe that's all you've got. So I don't think that that's really what intellectual life is about. It can get you in the door, but then you've got to leave it behind. Because in the end, I think every human being can think, reflect, contemplate, savor the world as it is. Everyone can have some contact with reality and can appreciate it. And, it's degrees and walks of life and styles of reflection. Those things might all be different. But it's very important that it actually be a bond of unity between one human being and another, and not something that separates us out. That's really crucial for the way I think about it. But it was hard work. So
is fair to say one of the recurring themes in the book is that the intellectual life shows you not that you're special, but that you're ordinary, right? I think that's almost every example you have is about the intellectual life puncturing one's self-worth rather than inflating it.
No, and if I had other examples than Albert Einstein, if I knew about all the ordinary, like the contemplative taxi drivers and the philosophical car mechanics, I would have written about them. But people don't write books about those guys. So you know them, they're in your family, they're your Uncle Jack or what have you. But they're not things that are easy to write about. So you cite
a lot of examples from a really great book by Jonathan Rose called it's about the intellectual life of the British working class in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it's came out about 20 years ago. It's a phenomenal book. One thing that the really, the savvy, politically engaged clever undergrad might say is, Dr. Hitz, you've told me to read, you've mentioned Homer and Thucydides, and all these people are just, they're just dead white males. you know, you have your Dorothy Day and Elena Ferrante, et cetera. But I mean, it's just dead white males, right? One of the things that jumped out at me, and I just want you to maybe talk about this. You have this great quote from W.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois has this line where he says, "I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From the caves of evening that swing between the strong limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn or condescension. So wed with truth, I dwell above the veil." And so Du Bois is saying, reading Shakespeare, reading Aurelius, reading Dumas, reading Balzac, it helps him transcend the kind of racial discrimination of the late 19th and early 20th century. Is that just false consciousness, right, on his part? Is it self-delusion? Or is Du Bois onto something?
I think if he were alone saying something like that, you might wonder, you know, maybe this is what a successful Black man, a successful Black academic of that time how they would see things. I think the more you know about Du Bois, the less plausible that is. He's the real deal. He's very authentic, very brave, very distinctive, thinks for himself. But then what becomes even more striking is that you find, the more you look, the more you find exactly that attitude. So Frederick Douglass, you know, who's born a slave, his master forbids him to learn how to read, and he teaches himself. You know, he finds letters here and there. He tricks schoolboys into teaching him stuff. And what does he sit down and read? He reads oration. You know, he has a collection of orations, mostly from the classical world, and that's where Frederick Douglass gets his oratory, where he gets his words, his vocabulary, his way of being. Now, he's a free man, I think. He's not in a false consciousness. He's liberated. He's liberated by books. So there's Douglass. You know, I just discovered recently, Du Bois's passage, it's about 20 years later than a woman named Anna Julia Cooper, who had one of the first Black women to get a PhD in the United States in mathematics. She says something extremely similar. You know, this is a woman who is educated, can sit with the best minds and have a real communion with other human beings that she can't have with living people of the same kind. So, and the Jonathan Rose book too, it's full of stories of working people who, you know, they pick up the books and they find a human being in the books, the author, and they find the human being that's themselves, and those human beings connect with one another. That's not to say that we're all, you know, when I talk about common humanity or what we have in common, I'm not saying we're all the same. We all are different. We all have different cultures and different backgrounds and different languages. And that part of what makes studying worthwhile is seeing all of the variety of all the facets of different ways of being human. But if there weren't something common, then it wouldn't be worthwhile either. And it wouldn't even work. So I think the harder you look at the history of especially Black Americans, but also other oppressed groups, you find that education is liberating. It doesn't induce a false consciousness. It sets you free, and you ingest all this stuff, whether it's white or it's male or whatever it is, and you make it into something else. If there's one thing I would really like people to know, it's something like that. It's like you can make these books into something different and something new, and you will do that in virtue of your being in a unique time and place.
One of my favorite examples of that is, MLK's letter from Birmingham City Jail, and it's who's the authority cited? Thomas Aquinas, right? It's all Thomistic natural law, exactly. Running through there, applied to 1960s America, and he clearly made it his own. And Aquinas wasn't some distant figure for him. It was the kind of person who explained why segregation is wrong in and of itself, even if it happens to be legal. There are two figures you write most about in this book. Another saint, Augustine of Hippo, and somebody who's not a saint, the Neapolitan novelist Elena Ferrante. And you hold up Augustine and Ferrante as two models of what honest self-investigation looks like. Augustine, a believer for whom honest self-investigation leads toward deeper understanding of God and a kind of and a sort of redemption. And then Ferrante, not someone religious, but you make the argument that art can be redemptive in and of itself. And I guess I wondered, when I read it, I didn't buy your Ferrante argument, or at least had some questions about it. And the question I had was, how is art redemptive, and what is it actually redeeming? And do you actually believe the case that you wrote out, or did you just need an example of somebody who wasn't religious to balance this off in the name of fairness?
Ouch. So I think I believe it. So, Augustine is an easier case for me because I'm also a believer. I'm also Roman Catholic. I'm also a convert. I also studied philosophy, so but I think it's a mistake to think that somehow only religious people can live an authentic intellectual life and can get all of its fruits. I don't think that's true. So the two examples are really brought in for a narrower question than you might have. So it connects to what you asked about earlier about arrogance, or one of the students asked about arrogance. These are two, the protagonist of the Neapolitan novels and Augustine in his own description. These are competitive young people. They're smart and they want to get ahead and they want to get to the top, and they don't care what it costs them or anyone else. So that's what they do. So then the question I have is, well, how is it that you get out of a situation like this? You're an intelligent person. There's something in there that actually wants to learn and to encounter reality, encounter truth for its own sake, but it's trapped in this hyper-competitive mode of life, set of habits. How does it crack? So there's a story about Augustine. Okay, he gets into this intellectual cult. He sees some contradictions. It starts to break down. And then he doesn't know what to believe anymore. He, meets this guy Ambrose, who's a bishop who he likes a lot. He's attracted, but he still can't make himself quite believe. Then he's convinced intellectually, but he can't quite make himself live like a Christian. And then finally he has this, this moment where he collapses and turns around. Okay. So that's one kind of story of how someone, and he's still egotistical even after he's converted. You can tell from his writing, but he's pointed in a different direction. He's no longer trying to climb the hierarchy of Roman officials. He has a different kind of life in view. So in the Neapolitan novels, what I think happens is it's this friendship between these two women, which is a type of contemplative friendship. They think about the people who they live with. They tell stories about them. They imagine their lives. They're both authors. They tell stories, fictional stories. Sometimes it's a recasting of their own lives. Sometimes they're writing about each other. And their friendship, their concern for one another, and their creative work ends up getting the protagonist out of that highly competitive mode and into something that is lasting, is good, is real, is connected at least with a real friendship, a real concern for another human being. So it's to me a story for sure about how someone gets from something worse to something better. Whether there's something yet better beyond that, I think there is, but I wouldn't discourage someone from going part of the way if that was the way that their life led them. So that's I wanted to encourage people who couldn't stomach the religion that there were other ways of making progress. And, you know, everyone knows what I think. Like, it's not a secret. But it's not a barrier to entry.
Yeah, one of the things that the Ferrante novels, I mean, unlike you know, Augustine, they take place in the modern world, and you know, they're set in a democratic regime, and you go back to Plato's Republic, and you make a case that there are lots of different barriers, lots of different things that make it hard to have an intellectual life. Pursuit of social status, pursuit of money, and you've talked about some of these. But one of the things it seems that comes through in your work is that actually living in a democracy makes it really hard. Weirdly enough, the regime that you have to make decisions about how you want to be governed actually seems, at least as I gather from you, hard. And you have this bit from Plato where you talked about, you know, the democratic character is about indulging your pleasures, flitting from thing to thing, frequently goes in for politics and bounces up and says whatever comes to his head. And then Plato says he calls this life of his pleasant, free, and blessed. Did I read you correctly that you think that democracy and the intellectual life are in tension with one another, if not mutually exclusive?
No, I actually didn't mean that, but I think it's really interesting that you saw it that way. In part because I'm an egalitarian. I believe that intellectual life is for everybody, and I think that communities work best when we all participate in them, we all share in them, we all have a stake in them. I actually really believe in democracy for that reason. And I think, even though it doesn't come out in the book, because it was something that I was thinking about sort of as I was finishing and after I finished the book more, but I actually do think that the type of intellectual life I defend is meant to be, works as a part of a vision of democratic community, even though that's not all that it is. And I wouldn't want to reduce it to that.
Okay.
So I think that the democratic character's there because it's such a perfect image of who we are. So I talk about how, we're so enchanted by spectacles and images, and it keeps us from getting into the depths. And that description of democratic character is the perfect example. It's like one day you think to yourself, I'm going to lose weight. Like the diet begins today. I'm going to the gym. The next day you're lying on the couch, you're listening to music, you're picking out on X, Y, or Z, and you're like, oh, pleasure. This is what I live for, So it's being drawn from one thing to the next, one image of yourself to the next. That's our lives, and it's not good. We've got to escape from it.
And you also talk about like the reduction of complex ideas to slogans, and you really don't like what you call opinionating in universities, and you say that modern universities want us to, I believe you say, absorb correct opinions, and that constitutes knowledge. And I maybe misread it. I took that to be part of a sort of, at least a concern about democratic regimes.
Well, you might be right. Maybe I have to think about this more. It's it hurts a little bit what you're saying, but it might be true that it might be that these are in some way inevitable features of a democratic regime, democratic culture. Even so, even if I were convinced of that, and it might be true, I would still want to say, well, democracy is good, and we've got to find a way to at least soften the blows of the things that are bad about it. So let's not reduce ourselves to opinions. Okay, once a year, election day, you've got to just reduce everything you've got to an opinion. It's like yes or no. Yes on Proposition 102. Yes or no. Republicans, yes or no. Democrats, yes or no. You have to do that, but at least do so with the knowledge that there's more to life there's more to understanding what's going on in the world than just, check the box.
The intellectual life is a way not to just live a life of opinions.
Yeah.
I want to get out of here. You've been patient, but I want to get out of here on a story about you. And now that we're at the end, I didn't want to begin with it. I want to end with it. The beginning of your book is a story of you going through grad school, and you've succeeded. Unlike Einstein, you got not 1, 2, but 3 academic jobs, in succession at McGill and at Auburn and at UMBC. And then you walked away from it. And I just tell us why you walked away from it, and then why you walked away from what you walked away from, right? What is it that made that thing? I mean, you're a searcher yourself. What were you searching, and what did you not find in the woods of Ontario?
Well, let's start with how I ended up in the woods of Ontario. So I was, as I've told all of you already, I've already revealed myself as being a hyper-competitive youngster who had to be superior to everything. So that's what I did. And I also loved learning. I mean, it wasn't like it was a simple thing. But part of what that meant was that I ended up being a successful academic. And to succeed, one of the problems with success is that you succeed on the terms of other people generally. So success in academic terms is you're a researcher primarily. You do research in a specialty, and that's the main thing that you do. And you're teaching, you're really trying to keep to a minimum so that you can make your research. And the research has a certain level of prestige and so on. So I was very much sucked into that. And I knew it was bad, but I couldn't quite escape from it. And I enjoyed doing research, but it wasn't the right focus for my whole life. And what I really missed, I know now, was real person-to-person teaching where your students, they know you, and you're helping them develop into the kinds of human beings that they want to be and that you want them to be. So I was missing that. I was missing that focus. And I had converted to Catholicism as an adult, and I was uncertain as to what that meant for me and how I should live differently. It seemed like a big deal. It didn't seem like I should just go to church on Sunday and do everything else just the same. So I looked at a lot of different communities. I wanted to, this is a key piece of it. I wanted to really serve other people, and I wanted to connect with a broader swathe of humanity than you do in academic circles. I wanted to feel like I was doing what I was doing in some way to help humanity in some grand way. So anyway, I looked at communities and I got very fed up with work, and I left. I went to this remote Catholic community in Eastern Ontario called Madonna House. And I had a wonderful experience there. It was absolutely irreplaceable. I recommend it to everybody. But I had everything really that I needed in life, apart from a way to use all of this education and intellectual training that I'd had already. Because at that point, I'd already had a PhD. I'd been teaching for some years. And here I was in the woods and not able to use really any of that. And that just wore on me. It wore on me from the beginning, and as time went on, it got worse. And so there's an old tradition. It goes back to the Bible, right? Jesus goes out, or John the Baptist goes out into the desert and fights with demons, and then comes back having figured something out. So that's how I see it sometimes. I figured out that the way that I needed to serve other human beings was by passing on this intellectual way of being that I had received myself as a young person. And what better place to do that than the place where I myself was an undergraduate. So I called them up. They had a job. I applied. I got the job very wonderfully. So anyway, that was what happened. That's the high drama part of my life, which I share in the first part of the book. And it's also really where a lot of my settled perspective on the intellectual life and why it matters and how it's part of a happy human life, where that all comes from is from that set of experiences, both getting disillusioned and retreating into the desert for a while and coming back out again. So
yeah, it's a great story. Okay, I said I'd get you out of this. One person asked something, and I think I'll leave it on this. This is somebody who was a fellow years ago at the GWF and is dialed in tonight. Great kid named Joe Hartgy. And he asked this question. You sort of answered it, but maybe just end on this, because most of the people, almost everyone on this call, will not go on to be an academic. God bless them. And the question is this. Joe's question is this: does intellectual life have to be separated from ordinary working life? Could sanctification of work open the intellectual life to everyone, as you described?
Well, it's interesting. So I want to separate that into two different parts. So no, intellectual life does not have to be separated from ordinary working life. You can carve out as much time as you can carve out, and there will be limits sometimes. And you can dedicate it to reading, studying, thinking, reflecting. You can set up a little study group. You can even find members of your family who are up for it. You can do it for yourself. It could be 20 minutes a day, it could be 2 hours a day, whatever it is, you can carve it out. And you should. It's important to do something like that. Now, the other question about the sanctification of work, I think is a bit different. And that is really more about how to be holy, how to be close to God, how to do God's will, which is much broader than intellectual life. So I think intellectual life is one way of doing that, but it's not the only way. So sanctification of work is really available, really to everyone. So you can be working really impossible, oppressive hours under terrible circumstances, and you could offer that work to God as a prayer. And in doing so, you are elevating it to a different level. But that may or may not be compatible with actually being able to read and think and reflect. So they're connected, but they're not exactly the same thing. And the second thing will always be there for you, no matter what. Intellectual life is I don't think it's as much of a luxury as people think it is, but it is a bit more of a luxury. As you need to have a little bit of time, a little bit of mental space. You need to not be totally exhausted in order to be able to carve that time out.
Well, thanks to you for carving out your time for us tonight. Thanks to everyone who is dialed in tonight for carving out your time for this. For those of you interested, the next Menard Family George Washington Forum event will be on February 11th, when Frank Decatur from the University of Hong Kong will talk with us about China and the world since 1949. In the meantime, thank you, Dr. Hitz, for joining us tonight. And I hope all of you have a good evening as well. Good night.